A simple roadside stop or so it seems, but when a racist sheriff decides to humiliate a black woman on the side of a rural Texas highway, he has no idea he just picked the wrong target. Because she's not just another driver, she's the head of internal affairs. What starts as an act of abuse turns into a wildfire of truth, accountability, and long overdue justice. And trust me, you won't believe how deep the corruption runs, or who ends up paying the price. So grab your seat, because this story is real, raw, and unforgettable. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. We love hearing from you. It was late afternoon in early October, the kind of golden Texas dusk that painted the landscape in soft amber tones and long, creeping shadows. Dr. Celeste Morgan, a woman in her mid-50s with quiet dignity and steely eyes, guided her dark gray Lincoln down a stretch of two-lane highway outside the small town of Red Bluff. Her hair, silver streaks threaded through soft black curls, was pinned neatly, and her posture behind the wheel radiated poise. She had just wrapped up a long day consulting on police ethics reforms in Austin and had taken a detour through Red Bluff to avoid highway congestion. She wasn't in a rush. She had earned her peace. Celeste had seen a lot in her career: decades in law enforcement, countless internal investigations, and more closed-door meetings than she could count had shaped her into one of the most respected heads of internal affairs in Texas. Yet even now, with all her years of service, she still felt something tighten in her chest whenever she drove through certain rural stretches of the state, places where the welcome felt thin, the stares lasted too long, and the wrong color skin still seemed to justify suspicion. As she passed an old Baptist church and a boarded-up gas station, red and blue lights suddenly exploded in her rearview mirror. A short burst of siren followed. Her eyes flicked to the speedometer. 48 and a 50. Turn signal had been used. No swerving. Everything had been by the book. She sighed, more tired than alarmed, and eased the Lincoln onto the gravel shoulder. The cruiser rolled to a stop behind her. She adjusted her mirror to get a look. A tall white man stepped out, late 50s to early 60s, with a chest-puffed gait that spoke more of pride than procedure. His boots crunched loudly against the dirt as he approached, hand resting just inches from his sidearm. On his uniform was a gleaming silver badge, Sheriff Brawley. Celeste lowered her window and folded her hands neatly in her lap. She kept her tone calm, professional. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" The sheriff didn't answer immediately. He leaned down, peering inside the vehicle like he was inspecting a suspect, rather than addressing a citizen. His eyes scanned her face, her tailored navy blue blazer, the briefcase on the passenger seat, the government tag on her dashboard. Yet something in his expression said none of it mattered. "License and registration," he said, curt and cold. She complied without a word, retrieving the documents from her purse and glove box and handing them over. Her fingers were steady, but her heart beat a little faster. The air had shifted. He stared at the license longer than necessary. "Celeste Morgan," he read slowly. "You from around here?" "My address is on the license, Sheriff," she replied evenly. He squinted, still holding her ID. "Well, we don't see many folks like you passing through Red Bluff." There it was. Celeste's jaw tensed, but she kept her tone measured. "Is there a specific reason you pulled me over, sir?" Raleigh didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step back and looked at her car again, like he was searching for something, anything, to justify this stop. "Just keeping our roads safe," he said, his smirk barely masked by professionalism. "You were well within the speed limit," he added, "but your taillight looked a little dim back there." She knew it wasn't. Her vehicle had passed inspection last week. This wasn't about a taillight. "I see," she said. "Would you like me to step out and check it with you?" His brow raised, surprised by her calmness, or maybe by her refusal to shrink. "No need," he said, though his tone said otherwise. "Just doing my job." Celeste nodded once, slowly, "and I respect that. But if I may be frank, This doesn't feel like a routine traffic stop. That touched a nerve. Raleigh stepped forward again, his posture tightening. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating how it feels. He stared at her for a long moment. The Texas breeze had gone still. Somewhere in the distance, a cicada buzzed. The sheriff didn't blink. Where exactly do you work, Miss Morgan? He asked. She didn't flinch. In public service. Doing what? She smiled faintly. Internal affairs. Raleigh's eyes narrowed. For who? Celeste tilted her head just slightly. Why don't you tell me why that matters? The sheriff's face darkened. Don't play games with me. You're not the one asking questions here. Celeste held his gaze. I'm not playing, Sheriff. Just protecting my rights. He stepped back, jaw clenched, her document still in his hand. It was clear he hadn't expected this. Not from her. And certainly not here, on his turf. What began as a power play was quickly turning into a personal challenge. And neither of them had any idea just how far this encounter would go. The Texas sun beat down with ruthless intensity, baking the gravel shoulder where Dr. Celeste Morgan now found herself standing. Sheriff Buck Raleigh had returned her license and registration with a tight, dismissive flick of the wrist, then casually told her to step out of the vehicle. No explanation, no cause, just a demand cloaked in authority. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing the odds, then quietly opened her door and complied. Her heels crunched softly as she stepped out, the dry wind catching her jacket as she stood up. Right, shoulders back. She could feel the burn of the afternoon sun against the back of her neck, could feel his eyes on her like a spotlight. He didn't look at her like she was a civilian or a professional. He looked at her like a problem he wanted to solve and fast. Hands on the hood, he barked. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Excuse me? You heard me. I'm not under arrest. He stepped forward. Do it. Now. She looked at the hood of her car. The metal shimmered under the sun, almost glowing. It had to be over 100 degrees on that surface. But she didn't argue, not yet. Instead, she turned and calmly placed her palms on the hot steel, flinching only slightly. It seared her skin. She could feel the heat through the thin layer of her blouse sleeves, but she didn't move. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Raleigh walked a slow circle around her car, his boots dragging deliberately in the gravel. She heard him mutter something under his breath, something about uppity and big city lady, and then the sound of his radio crackled. Deputy Miller, come out here to Highway 17. Got a situation I want backup for. Celeste didn't move. Her breathing was steady, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the dry fields. The cicadas had grown louder. Her hands were still burning. The physical pain was real, but the deeper sting came from something older, more familiar, the humiliating ache of being treated like she didn't belong, like she was a threat, not a person. She had spent a lifetime fighting that feeling. And here it was again. Within minutes, a second patrol car arrived. A younger deputy, no older than 30, stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his eyes uncertain as they landed on Celeste and then darted toward Raleigh. She could see it instantly. He was nervous. This wasn't standard procedure, and he knew it. She give you any trouble, Sheriff? The deputy asked, shifting his weight. Raleigh scoffed. Not yet. The young man nodded, glancing again at Celeste, then back at the sheriff. Should we search the vehicle? Celeste turned her head slightly. Do you have probable cause? Her voice was level, quiet, but carried weight. Raleigh stepped in. You don't get to ask the questions, ma'am. I'm just asking for the legal basis of this stop, she replied. You said it was a dim taillight, which it isn't. Now you've called backup and had me put my hands on a hot car. I've complied with every order, so I'm just wondering what comes next. That struck a nerve. Raleigh's jaw clenched, and for a moment, it looked like he might lash out, but the presence of the younger deputy seemed to temper him. He didn't want a witness to whatever he might have said next. She's being combative, he muttered to his radio. Mouthy. Celeste almost laughed. Mouthy, she repeated under her breath, shaking her head. Is that your report? The deputy looked increasingly uncomfortable. He fidgeted, eyes darting between them. "Sheriff," he said cautiously, "she hasn't resisted anything." "Maybe we should," Raleigh cut him off with a sharp glare. "Go check the trunk," he ordered. Celeste turned then, slowly and fully, taking her hands off the hood despite the burning, her palms now pink and sore. Her voice was stronger now, firmer. "You do not have consent to search my vehicle." "I don't need it," Raleigh snapped. "Yes, Sheriff," she said, eyes locked on his. "You do, unless you have a warrant or probable cause. And you have neither." Raleigh's hand twitched near his belt, hovering close to the handcuffs. "Are you resisting?" "I'm exercising my rights," she said. There was silence. The deputy stood frozen, caught between orders and law. The tension was thick enough to slice. A pickup truck passed by slowly on the opposite side of the highway, the driver rubbernecking, then speeding up once he caught sight of the two patrol cars and Celeste standing straight, a black woman in professional clothes, facing down a sheriff. Raleigh took a step forward, lowering his voice. "You don't know who you're messing with, do you?" Celeste stared him down, calm as ever. "No, Sheriff, but you don't either." The deputy blinked. "Wait, what?" Raleigh held her gaze, his mouth tightening, trying to regain control. But something was shifting now. His confidence, so firm, so loud just moments ago, was faltering. Celeste reached slowly into her blazer. "Since we're apparently skipping protocol," she said, "perhaps it's time I show you this." The deputy stiffened. Raleigh's hand went to his holster. "Easy," Celeste said calmly. "It's not a weapon." She pulled out a leather badge wallet and flipped it open. The gold shield gleamed in the sun, crisp and unmistakable. "Deputy Inspector General, State of Texas, Division of Internal Affairs." The younger deputy took an instinctive step back. His face went pale. "Oh, God!" Raleigh blinked like he'd just been slapped. "I tried to keep this professional," Celeste said. "But you've made it personal." Raleigh looked down at the badge, then back at her, stunned silent for the first time. His hand dropped from his belt. His posture changed. His voice, when it returned, was quieter, defensive. "Well, why didn't you say that from the start?" "I don't need to explain my credentials to justify my dignity," Celeste replied. And with that, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the weight of realization and the storm that was about to follow. For a long second, no one said anything. The breeze carried the quiet hum of insects, and the golden light danced across the cracked asphalt. Celeste stood calm, arms relaxed at her sides, the Internal Affairs badge still open in her hand. She didn't wave it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The emblem gleamed in the sun like a mirror held up to the arrogance in front of her. Deputy Miller took a full step backward, his face pale with realization. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dry and tight. She's with IA." Celeste slowly folded the badge wallet and slid it back into her blazer. "Deputy Inspector General, Texas Department of Internal Affairs. My full title. If either of you had asked instead of assuming, this would have gone very differently." Raleigh's eyes twitched, something primal behind them, fighting the very concept of being wrong, especially by a black woman. His lips parted, but no words came. It wasn't just embarrassment that stiffened his shoulders, it was something closer to fear. Not physical fear, institutional fear. The kind of fear that crawls in when someone realizes they might finally be held accountable. "You think that badge scares me?" he said at last, his voice hoarse but laced with forced bravado. "No," Celeste said simply. "I think it should." The air thickened between them. Celeste watched him like a scientist observing a subject. She'd seen this dance before countless times. Men like Raleigh weren't rare. In her experience, they were often the most predictable, all swagger and bluster, until the mirror got held up too close. "I suggest," she continued, "that you get on the radio and call a supervisor, someone from the state, because you've officially entered the kind of situation Internal Affairs investigates." and we take officer misconduct seriously." Raleigh's jaw flexed. "This is my county," he muttered, as if that meant something in the face of what he'd just done. "You're out of your lane." "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Celeste replied. "And the fact that you don't know that tells me how overdue this visit is." Miller's voice cracked in again, this time with more urgency. "Sheriff, if she's really who she says she is, I know who she is," Raleigh barked. "I know damn well now." Celeste raised a single brow. "Then you know your next move is being watched." Raleigh held still for a beat longer, chest heaving, then yanked his radio from his shoulder. "This is Sheriff Raleigh," he growled into the mic. "Requesting a supervisor to my location. Highway 17 near mile marker 88. We've got an official inquiry underway." The words were difficult for him, like chewing gravel. But he said them. Celeste didn't move. She knew how quickly tension could escalate again if egos weren't managed. Sheriff Raleigh wasn't done, not emotionally, probably not politically. But procedurally, the game had shifted, and he knew it. The mask of authority he wore so confidently minutes earlier had slipped, revealing something uglier underneath panic. Deputy Miller stood off to the side now, posture rigid, hands on his belt but eyes lowered. Celeste glanced at him, then looked back at Raleigh. "May I sit in my car while we wait?" she asked, her tone dry but cordial. Raleigh paused, then gave a tight nod. "Fine." She didn't thank him. She turned and opened her door, sliding back into the driver's seat with measured grace. Her hands stung from the earlier contact with the hood, but she showed no sign of discomfort. Instead, she pulled out a small leather notebook from the center console and began to write. Dates, times, names. She'd done this dance enough to know the value of documentation, especially when standing on hostile ground. She could see Raleigh pacing in her side mirror, whispering into his radio again, voice hushed but urgent. She imagined the dispatcher on the other end, probably just as stunned. A sheriff calling for state backup because he'd pulled over a black woman who turned out to be the head of internal affairs? That wasn't just news, it was potential scandal. 15 minutes passed. Then came the crunch of new tires on gravel. A sleek, unmarked black SUV pulled up behind the cruisers. From it stepped a woman in a crisp khaki uniform and mirrored sunglasses. She was Latina, mid-50s, composed, her badge shining on her chest like a warning light. Captain Maria Delgado. Celeste saw her, and the tension in her chest loosened slightly. At least someone reasonable had arrived. Delgado walked straight toward Raleigh. "What's going on here, Sheriff?" Celeste got out of the car and approached quietly, standing to the side but within earshot. Raleigh fumbled. "We had a traffic stop, but it's more complicated now. He gestured toward Celeste with a twitch of his chin. She's claiming to be internal affairs." "She isn't claiming," Celeste said. "She is, and you know that." Delgado turned to Celeste, recognizing her immediately. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but her voice remained professional. "Dr. Morgan, I didn't know you were in the area." "Neither did he," Celeste replied. Delgado turned back to Raleigh. "Did you detain her?" Raleigh's face flushed, temporarily. She was being difficult. "Did you have probable cause?" She had a dim taillight. Delgado turned to Deputy Miller. "Is that accurate?" Miller hesitated, then shook his head. "No, ma'am. Her lights were all working when I got here." The silence that followed was colder than the breeze. Delgado's eyes narrowed. "I'd like to review your dashcam footage, Sheriff, right now." Raleigh didn't respond. His hand hovered near his keys. Delgado folded her arms, waiting. "I'll get it," he muttered finally. As he stomped off to his cruiser, Delgado turned back to Celeste. "You all right?" Celeste nodded. "Burns on the palms, but I've had worse." Delgado exhaled through her nose, jaw tight. "He's got a record. Internal complaints dismissed by the county. That's why we flagged Red Bluff for monitoring." "I suspected as much," Celeste said. "But now we've got first-hand experience." Delgado nodded. "Let's document everything. This isn't just a report anymore." As Raleigh returned with the dashcam device, his steps had lost their swagger. And though he didn't know it yet, the damage had already been done. A badge, when used right, shines light in the darkest places. And Raleigh had just stepped into that light unprepared and unarmed. Captain Maria Delgado stood with her arms crossed as Sheriff Raleigh plugged the dashcam device into the side of her department-issued laptop. The sheriff's fingers were stiff, fumbling just slightly, but his face remained locked in that practiced blank expression, the kind worn by men who had made a career out of pushing boundaries without consequence. Celeste stood just a few feet away, hands now bandaged from the minor burns on her palms. A paramedic, dispatched by Delgado as a precaution, had offered to escort her to urgent care, but she had politely declined. The sting in her hands wasn't as pressing as the fire in her chest. She wanted to see this through, and Delgado knew better than to try and stop her. "Let's take a look," Delgado said, clicking through the video files until the right timestamp appeared on screen. The grainy footage played, Celeste's car pulling over, Raleigh approaching, their conversation beginning. There was no raised voice from Celeste, no resistance, no aggression, just calm, direct questions that clearly annoyed Raleigh. The footage showed him ordering her out, barking at her to put her hands on the hood, and circling her like a predator. The mic picked up every word of his muttered insults. "Thinks she's somebody. Look at her all dressed up like she's better than folks." Then, after calling for backup, came the worst part. These types always try to act smart. Delgado leaned back in her seat, her mouth a thin line. She didn't look at Raleigh immediately. She clicked pause and let the silence settle like dust. "You want to explain any of that?" she finally asked. Raleigh shifted uncomfortably. "It's not what it sounds like. I was trying to assess the situation." "Assess?" Delgado asked, incredulous. "By humiliating a state official? By detaining someone without cause and making derogatory comments on a department-issued recording?" "She didn't identify herself right away," he argued. Celeste's voice cut in. "Because I didn't need to. I wasn't under investigation. I wasn't a threat. And I wasn't breaking the law. You stopped me under false pretenses. You escalated the situation based on a gut feeling. And let's be honest, Sheriff, that feeling was rooted in race, not risk." Raleigh turned toward her, and for a second, his mask slipped. "Lady, you think everything's about race." "No," Celeste replied, voice steady. "But this was." Delgado stood, closing the laptop. "We'll need a formal statement from both you and Deputy Miller," she said. "As of this moment, Sheriff Raleigh, you're relieved of active field duty pending internal review." "You're suspending me?" Raleigh asked, stunned. "I'm protecting the integrity of the department," Delgado replied. "And the state. You'll turn over your badge and weapon. You'll be placed on administrative leave until the investigation concludes." "I didn't assault her," he insisted. "You didn't have to," Delgado said. "You weaponized your authority. That alone is grounds for an ethics review." Celeste stepped forward, her gaze level. "You didn't just humiliate me, Sheriff. You humiliated the badge we both wear, and the people you swore to protect." Raleigh's face was a storm of conflicting emotion, rage, shame, confusion. Men like him didn't often face consequences. Their mistakes were usually smoothed over with paperwork or swept under the rug with a wink. But something different was happening now. The air had changed. The room felt heavier, real. "I'll fight this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Of course you will," Delgado said without sympathy. "But you won't do it wearing that badge." She held out her hand, palm up. After a long pause, Raleigh unpinned the silver star from his chest and placed it in her hand. He didn't look anyone in the eye as he did it. The silence afterward was brutal. Delgado turned toward Celeste. "Would you like to file your official complaint now or back in Austin?" Celeste looked at the sheriff for a beat, then shook her head. "I'll do it in Austin. I want it on the record, not buried in local files." Delgado nodded, then looked to Deputy Miller. "You'll escort Dr. Morgan to her vehicle and take her statement. I'll stay here with the sheriff and begin the internal log." Miller looked pale but determined. "Yes, ma'am." Celeste followed him back toward her car. The deputy didn't say much until they were a few yards away from the others. Then he glanced over and said quietly, "I didn't know who you were, but even if you weren't who you are, that shouldn't have happened." Celeste gave him a tired but not unkind smile. "You're right, and thank you for saying that." He opened the passenger door for her as she climbed back into the Lincoln. She sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle over her, the heat, the humiliation, the power shift, the consequences now set in motion. As the door closed and Miller stepped back to take her statement, Celeste looked in her rearview mirror one last time. Sheriff Raleigh stood by his patrol car, no longer in control, his badge gone, his authority dimmed. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a beginning, and beginnings, she knew, were powerful things. Back in Austin, the early morning sun spilled through the tall windows of Celeste Morgan's office, casting warm light across the stacks of reports and case files piled neatly on her desk. She sat in her usual seat, a firm but cushioned chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin, eyes focused on the glowing screen before her. The events in Red Bluff still echoed in her bones, but now those echoes had become momentum. It wasn't the first time she'd seen misconduct behind a badge, but it was the first time in a long while that she'd felt it up close, raw, personal, and public. She clicked through the internal portal and opened the complaint log for Sheriff Buck Raleigh. As expected, there were several prior grievances filed over the past 8 years. But the further she read, the more patterns began to emerge. Many complaints had been marked as resolved or unfounded. Witness statements were vague. In one case, the complainant mysteriously withdrew their report 2 days after filing. Another report, submitted by a Mexican-American farmhand, detailed an incident of excessive force during a traffic stop dismissed due to lack of evidence, even though the man's nose had been broken and photographs were attached. Celeste leaned back in her chair. Something wasn't adding up. These weren't just isolated events. They were part of a consistent pattern of intimidation and abuse, and someone had been making sure those incidents didn't gain traction. She opened a new document and began to build what she called a link map, connecting names, dates, types of complaints, and resolutions. She cross-referenced each case with the names of individuals involved in dismissing or closing them. One name kept appearing: County Commissioner Dale Finnerty. Finnerty's name had been tagged in internal correspondence between the Red Bluff Sheriff's Department and the County Oversight Committee. Celeste wasn't surprised. Finnerty and Raleigh had grown up together, played football in high school together, and had both built their careers in lockstep. The commissioner had a reputation for playing kingmaker in Red Bluff and for protecting his people. She clicked through the records and found that Finnerty had personally intervened in at least 3 prior internal investigations into Sheriff Raleigh's conduct. In each case, the review had been abruptly closed, or the investigating officer had been reassigned. She even found an old email, dated 2 years ago, where Finnerty advised the local internal affairs liaison to avoid ruffling feathers over minor community tension. Minor community tension. Celeste scoffed under her breath. That tension had bruised bodies, broken trust, and silenced voices. She sent off a request for access to closed personnel files for Raleigh's top deputies, including Deputy Harland Mayfield, an older officer who had been with the department for over 30 years. Something told her that Mayfield knew more than he ever put on paper. Older cops, especially those who had seen everything, usually did. They just didn't talk unless they had reason to. Celeste stood and walked to the window, sipping her lukewarm coffee, staring out at the skyline. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, strong and still. There was something different in her now, not just anger, not just resolve. This was personal. Raleigh had gone after her not knowing who she was, and while that worked in her favor, it reminded her how many others didn't have that advantage. She thought of the young man in one of the complaints, 17 years old, slammed against a squad car for talking back. She thought of the elderly black woman who filed a report saying Raleigh forced her grandson to lie on the ground during a stop in front of their church. That case had been dismissed for lack of corroborating witness. She remembered her grandfather's stories about growing up in the Deep South, about how the uniform could mean protection or power unchecked. Celeste had joined the force to make change from the inside, and now, decades later, she found herself staring down the same legacy her ancestors had warned her about. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Captain Delgado. FYI, Raleigh retained counsel, pressuring Finnerty to push back on investigation. We'll keep you posted, Maria Celeste sighed, unsurprised. She returned to her desk, opened a new case file labeled Red Bluff Accountability Report, and began outlining her findings. She included timestamps from the dashcam footage, excerpts from complaints, names of dismissed cases, and a timeline of Finnerty's involvement. The documentation wasn't just for bureaucracy, it was armor. Every word mattered. An hour later, she called a meeting with her internal team, 4 seasoned officers, 2 analysts, and 1 legal liaison. In the briefing room, she projected her findings across the screen and walked them through the pattern she'd uncovered. This is systemic, she said. We're not just talking about one bad sheriff. We're talking about a power structure built to protect itself. Red Bluff isn't a town with a rogue cop problem. It's a town where people in power have created a shield around abuse. One of the analysts, a younger black woman named Kendra, raised her hand. Do we have the authority to investigate a sitting county commissioner? Celeste looked her in the eye. We do now. I've sent a request to the State Oversight Board to expand our jurisdiction into county operations. They'll push back, but we have momentum, and the public's watching. Kendra nodded. Then let's do it. They broke into task teams, each assigned specific pieces, reviewing older case files, contacting former complainants, digging into Finnerty's financial disclosures. Celeste stayed behind after the meeting, rereading a statement from a retired deputy who had once anonymously submitted concerns about Raleigh, but later vanished from the department without a trace. She made a note to find him. Before heading home that evening, she stared at the photos on her wall, snapshots from her time in the academy, citations of commendation, and a faded black and white photo of her father in uniform. A man who, despite the odds, had worn the badge with integrity. As she turned off the lights and locked her office door, she felt the familiar hum of tension in her shoulders, not from fear, but from focus. The kind of weight that comes when you're getting close to something big. Sheriff Raleigh had thought he could humiliate her and move on, but now the storm was building. And Celeste Morgan was at the center of it, not as a victim, but as the one holding the ledger. The first message showed up the next morning. No sender, no return address. Just a plain envelope slipped under the office door with a single line typed on cheap paper. Turn back before it turns on you. Celeste stared at it for a full minute before slipping on latex gloves and sealing it in an evidence bag. It wasn't the first time she'd been threatened during an investigation, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a warning, it was personal. She didn't mention it to her team right away. She needed their focus on the case, not on her. Still, when she left work that evening, she scanned the parking garage carefully. Every sound echoed. Every step seemed louder than usual. When she approached her Lincoln, she noticed fresh scratches along the rear passenger door. Deep, intentional. She pulled out her phone, snapped pictures, and sent them to Captain Delgado with a brief caption. They're watching. Later that night, in the quiet of her hotel room, Celeste sat by the window, sipping lukewarm chamomile tea. Her hands still ached from the incident with Raleigh, and her back carried the weight of sleepless nights. She opened her laptop, scanning news alerts about Red Bluff. A local radio station had picked up on the story, Sheriff Suspended After Traffic. Stop Sparks, Statewide Scrutiny. The comments section, as expected, was a battlefield. Some applauded the suspension. Others raged about city folks meddling in small-town law. A few were uglier than others, full of dog whistles and veiled threats. By the next morning, Celeste's hotel tires had been slashed, all 4 of them. It was a clear message. right there in broad daylight. The hotel manager apologized profusely and offered security camera footage. The video caught a man in a hoodie crouching next to her car just after 2 a.m. Face covered. No license plate. Professional. Celeste filed a police report, but deep down, she already knew it would go nowhere. In a place like this, when the sheriff had friends in every alley and diner booth, justice came slow, if at all. Still, she refused to back down. She changed hotels, doubled security measures, and kept working. The next step was to confront the people of Red Bluff directly. If the system had protected Raleigh for this long, it was because too many people had stayed quiet for too long. Celeste wasn't just here to write a report, she was here to listen. Captain Delgado organized a community town hall at the local civic center, a low-slung building with folding chairs and flickering overhead lights. Celeste arrived early, dressed in soft blue, no badge visible. She didn't want authority to speak for her. She wanted her voice to speak for itself. At first, only a handful of people trickled in. An older black couple who sat quietly in the back, a young Latina mother wrangling 2 children, a white farmer in boots too clean to be from the fields. Then more arrived, and more. By the time the meeting started, nearly 70 people filled the room, many of them standing. Delgado opened the session with a brief explanation of the ongoing investigation, assuring the crowd that it wasn't about punishment, it was about truth. Then she introduced Celeste. Celeste stepped up to the microphone, heart steady, voice clear. "I'm not here to tear your town apart," she began. "I'm here because people in your community, your neighbors, your children, your friends, have been harmed. And no matter what uniform you wear or how long you've lived here, no one is above the law." A beat of silence. "I've served in internal affairs for more than 20 years. I've worked with good officers. I've also investigated corrupt ones. What I saw on that highway last week wasn't just a bad decision. It was a window into something deeper, a culture of fear, of silence. And I'm asking you to help break that silence." At first, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a voice rose from the back. "I filed a complaint 2 years ago," said a black man in his 60s. "Sheriff Raleigh pulled me over because, if it a description. Never said what description. Just made me stand there in the rain while he tore through my truck. When I asked what he was looking for, he said, 'A reason.' I never heard back about that complaint." Another voice joined in. "My son got stopped 3 times in 1 month just for walking home from school," said the Latina mother. "They said he looked suspicious. He's 12. A white woman in her 70s stood next. "I've lived here all my life. My grandson got detained for loitering outside the post office. He was waiting for me. I filed a report. The next day, my mailbox was smashed." Stories poured out quiet at first, then stronger. The floodgates had opened. For every complaint that had been buried, there was a voice now lifting it up. For every lie told under oath, there was a truth rising to meet it. Celeste listened, taking notes, nodding, letting each speaker feel seen. She didn't need to direct the room. It had taken on a rhythm of its own, one born of pain, but also of hope. The community was reclaiming its voice. Then, toward the end of the meeting, an unexpected voice cut through the room. "I knew something was wrong," said a familiar face, Alton Gibbs, a retired white police chief from a neighboring county. His hair was snow-white, his voice gravelly but firm. "But I didn't speak up. I knew Raleigh when he was just a deputy. He was always good at acting just inside the law. But I saw him cross the line more than once. And I let it go, because back then I thought it wasn't my fight." He paused. "But I was wrong. It was always my fight. It's all of ours." The room was quiet again, but this time with weight, not hesitation. Celeste felt something shift, like the tide had turned. For the first time, Red Bluff didn't feel like enemy territory. It felt like a battleground that could be won. As the meeting ended, people came to shake her hand, to thank her. One elderly woman pressed a folded piece of paper into her palm. "I couldn't speak in front of everyone," she whispered, "but this is what happened to my grandson. Please read it." Celeste nodded, clutching the note, the warmth of the woman's hand still lingering. Outside the Civic Center, the stars had come out. They shimmered above Red Bluff, like quiet witnesses. Celeste breathed in the cool night air, the tension in her chest just a little lighter. They had tried to silence her with threats, but all they had done was give her more people to fight for. The following week, the buzz around Red Bluff changed. You could feel it in the diner booths, hear it in the murmurs at the feed store, and see it in the side glances exchanged on Main Street. It wasn't just that Sheriff Raleigh had been publicly embarrassed. It was that someone had come into town and dared to challenge the machinery that had rolled unopposed for decades. And now, more voices were joining in. Celeste Morgan stood in front of a corkboard in her temporary field, office an old converted classroom, inside the county annex building. Notes and photos were pinned in careful rows, like puzzle pieces forming a picture too large for one person to see alone. But she wasn't alone anymore. Each day, more people called, emailed, or showed up in person with a story. Small ones, big ones, many that had never been documented. At first, they came quietly afraid, uncertain. But then came the shift. His name was Alton Gibbs, the former police chief from the neighboring county, who had spoken at the town hall with a trembling voice and an honest heart. A man in his 70s, retired, weathered by time and guilt. After that meeting, he'd contacted Celeste and asked to give a formal statement. "I should have done this years ago," he told her as he sat across from her, his hands folded, voice rough from years of tobacco and silence. "I saw Raleigh break protocol, use force where it wasn't needed, joke about planting evidence. I thought, if I said something, it'd just ruin my own career, so I stayed quiet." He looked up, ashamed but determined. "I won't be quiet now." His testimony was powerful, not just for what it said, but for who said it. A white man, a lifelong cop, someone people in Red Bluff still respected. When the local paper ran an article with the headline, "Retired Chief Supports Investigation, Breaks Silence on Raleigh, Everything Shifted," the article was shared across town, then picked up by a regional outlet. By the end of the day, it was on local news, and that's when the calls came flooding in. A black farmer named Levi, 63, came to her office the next morning with a torn envelope full of old documents records he had kept from a property dispute where Raleigh had allegedly sided with a white neighbor over a fencing line. The sheriff's ruling forced Levi to lose 5 acres of land. "He told me it wasn't personal," Levi said, but the way he laughed, the way he said, "That's the price of not voting the right way?" Oh, it was personal. A Native American veteran named Charles Graywolf walked in the next day. He limped from an old war injury and wore a denim jacket covered in patches. He sat down across from Celeste and told her that Raleigh once pulled him over on his way home from a tribal ceremony. "He made me take off my headdress," Charles said, voice low and steady. "Said it looked like gang colors. I was 60 years old, decorated, been through war, and that man treated me like I was nothing." Celeste listened to every word, took every note, recorded every statement with care. The pain these people carried wasn't just about a sheriff. It was about being ignored, overlooked, dismissed for years. But they were speaking now, and that mattered. She compiled the testimonies, documented the connections, cross-referenced each complaint with departmental records. Every day she filled more of the board, and every day the town began to change. People who once crossed the street to avoid the courthouse were now walking in, heads high. Then came the youth. It started with a teenager named Darius, 17, tall and quiet. He had come to one of the smaller listening sessions Celeste hosted at the community center. After it ended, he waited behind while others filed out. "He made me kneel on the ground in front of my school," Darius said, not meeting her eyes. Said I looked like I was hiding something in my backpack. My little sister was crying. She tried to tell him it was just books. He told her to shut up. Celeste felt her heart tighten. Did anyone witness this? Yeah, a few kids, a teacher. But no one said anything. They were scared. Celeste nodded. "You're brave for coming here." Darius gave a shy shrug. I don't want my sister to think that's normal." That one sentence stayed with her. It rang louder than any headline, more powerful than any press release. She pinned Darius's statement next to a photo of him and his sister taken by their mother that morning, both smiling, hopeful. It reminded Celeste why she was doing this, not just for justice, but for the future. As the week continued, something unexpected began to happen. People who once supported Raleigh began to rethink their silence. It wasn't overnight. Some grumbled, some stayed defensive, but a few crossed lines they never would have imagined. At the Friday night high school football game, Celeste stood quietly near the back of the bleachers, watching from a distance. A group of teenage boys nearby were passing around a phone, watching a clip from the local news about the investigation. One of them, blonde, maybe 17, looked up and pointed toward her. "Hey, that's her," he said. A pause. Then another kid added, "She's the one who made Raleigh back off." There was no hostility, no mocking, just awe, respect. And that's when it hit her. She wasn't just changing the system, she was changing the culture. Later that night, as she walked back to her car, a woman stepped out from the shadows near the parking lot. She was older, maybe 75, with white hair pulled into a bun and a voice like sandpaper. "My grandson is one of them boys," the woman said. "He told me he thinks you're brave." Celeste smiled gently. "He's the brave one, he's the one listening." The woman nodded slowly. "Well, it's been a long time since someone made this town listen." And then she did something unexpected. She hugged Celeste. No words, just a long, firm embrace, like passing something down from one generation to the next. When Celeste finally sat in her car that night, she didn't feel alone anymore. She didn't feel like an outsider or a stranger passing through. She felt like part of something greater, a wave building, unstoppable. She wasn't just fighting back against one man, she was helping a town reclaim its soul. By the start of the third week, the case had moved beyond Red Bluff. State officials in Austin, once content to let the investigation quietly run its course, were now under pressure from the public. News outlets were digging into Raleigh's past. Major newspapers were calling for accountability, and Celeste Morgan's name was becoming synonymous with justice in small-town America. The governor's office, under increasing scrutiny, authorized a formal statewide review of misconduct within rural law enforcement, starting with Red Bluff. Celeste received the news while seated in the back of a small SUV, crawling down a dirt road toward the sheriff's office. The timing felt poetic. She had just been reviewing testimony from a young woman who'd witnessed her older brother being assaulted during a routine stop in 2021. Raleigh, the report said, had told the boy he was lucky to be walking. The boy never filed a complaint, he'd been too afraid. But his sister had remembered every detail, and now she had come forward with clarity and courage. Captain Delgado met Celeste at the Red Bluff County Courthouse steps, papers in hand, eyes sharp and focused. A joint task force had been authorized. Internal affairs, state auditors, and representatives from the Attorney General's office. They tried to bury it, but the pressure got too loud, Delgado said. Too many eyes watching now. Celeste nodded, her face unreadable. Good. Let them watch. Together, they entered the building, flanked by a team of investigators and legal aides. The sheriff's department was eerily quiet. Without Raleigh, there was no one striding around with boots clapping or voices barking orders. His absence had created a vacuum, and in that silence, the truth was ready to speak. A uniformed officer greeted them, hesitant but cooperative, unlocking doors, opening files, pointing toward the internal server room. Delgado's team moved fast. Hard drives were collected, case logs printed. They confiscated 2 desktop towers, a drawer full of marked evidence bags that had never been processed, and a separate folder labeled Disputes, Sensitive. That last one held the worst of it. Celeste opened it carefully, flipping through files that had been buried deep in the system. Racially charged traffic stops, reports of verbal abuse, complaints from local churches, One form, dated 5 years ago, had a yellow sticky note attached. "Deal with this later. DFDFDLE Finnerty, the commissioner." Her breath caught, just for a second. That single sticky note, casual, careless, was the link she needed. It connected the systemic cover-ups to the political machine that had protected Raleigh for years. By noon, a press conference was announced. The governor's office wanted transparency, and Celeste agreed. She didn't want the people of Red Bluff, or the rest of Texas, to hear this through rumors. She wanted them to hear it from the woman who had seen the truth with her own eyes. Outside the courthouse, under a sky thick with gray clouds and tension, cameras rolled and microphones extended toward the podium. Celeste stood behind it, flanked by Delgado and 2 state attorneys. She didn't speak in legalese. She didn't read from a script. Instead, she spoke from memory. For years, she began, residents of this county have raised concerns about abuse of power, about intimidation, about being treated as less than equal under the law. Many of those concerns were ignored deliberately. Today, we can confirm that Sheriff Raleigh not only acted in violation of state policy, but did so with the knowledge and, in several instances, the protection of County Commissioner Dale Finnerty. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled frantically. "We have collected evidence," she continued, including emails, suppressed reports, and witness statements. An internal memo from the commissioner himself shows efforts to halt investigations and protect the sheriff from oversight. That's not just unethical, it's illegal. When she stepped down, the questions came fast. Will there be charges? Has the commissioner been arrested? Was this racially motivated? Celeste answered what she could. "We're pursuing every legal path available," she said. "And yes, there's clear evidence that race played a role in how Sheriff Raleigh treated certain residents." Inside the courthouse, Raleigh sat quietly in a holding room, his lawyer pacing beside him. The former sheriff looked smaller now, stripped of his badge and bluster. His lawyer had warned him not to speak, but Raleigh kept mumbling under his breath. "It's all political. She's got the cameras, I got set up." But the recordings told a different story. The task force had uncovered multiple dashcam videos from as far back as 2016 videos never turned over to state archives. One showed Raleigh telling a young black man, "You walk like a thug, I treat you like one." Another recorded him chuckling with a deputy after threatening to lock up that preacher if he runs his mouth again. But the most damning came from a 2020 incident. A woman was pulled over late at night. The video showed her hands shaking on the steering wheel as Raleigh berated her for 5 full minutes. When she asked if she could call someone, he replied, "Sure, call Jesus. See if he can stop me." That recording sealed his fate. The Attorney General announced a full investigation into the Sheriff's Department and the Commissioner's office. Raleigh was formally charged with civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. Finnerty was served a subpoena and placed on administrative leave pending a criminal probe. Word spread fast. By evening, national networks had picked up the story. CNN, MSNBC, EVEN, Fox News, though their spin was more cautious. Headlines across screens read, "Texas Sheriff Indicted After IA Chief Exposes Widespread Abuse." Commissioner linked to cover-up in rural policing scandal. Back in Red Bluff, people gathered in church halls, coffee shops, and community centers not in protest, but in conversation. They talked about what it all meant, about who had been complicit and who had been afraid, about what would come next. And in the middle of it all was Celeste, still working, still listening. She knew the arrests and headlines were only the beginning. True reform didn't come from a gavel or a camera flash. It came from rebuilding trust, from changing the culture that let men like Raleigh thrive. She met with community leaders and clergy, helped draft proposals for a civilian oversight board, and advised on new ethics training for local officers. One evening, she sat with a group of high school students, including Darius and his sister, and asked them what they wanted their town to look like. "I just want to be able to walk home and not worry," Darius said quietly. His words stayed with her. That night, Celeste walked alone through the streets of Red Bluff. People nodded to her now. Some even stopped to thank her. An older white man tipped his hat and said, "You did something mighty brave, ma'am. This town needed it." She nodded in return, her heart heavy with gratitude but also caution. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but justice had taken root. And for the first time in a long time, Celeste Morgan believed that something better was possible not just in Red Bluff, but in every town that had learned to mistake silence for peace. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet, as Sheriff Buck Raleigh took his seat at the defense table. He looked older than before, grayer around the temples. His uniform traded for a wrinkled beige suit that didn't quite fit. His jaw clenched tightly as the clerk called the hearing to order. Behind him sat a handful of supporters, most silent now, unsure of what to say or how much to believe. The rest of the gallery was filled with reporters, state officials, and community members, some of whom had been waiting years for this moment. Celeste Morgan sat just a few rows back, composed and calm. Her navy blue suit was pressed, her notepad balanced across her knee. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to witness. This wasn't just about one man's guilt. It was about reckoning with years of silence, of fear, of damage that had run deeper than many realized. She scanned the courtroom, recognizing several faces from the community meetings, the town hall, even the church pews. Their presence made her chest tighten with a quiet pride. The prosecution called their first witness, a black high school teacher named Mr. Langston, who recounted how Raleigh had stopped him outside the school on suspicion of lurking. The video had already been shown on local news, but hearing Langston describe the humiliation in his own voice was another matter entirely. He spoke with restraint, but the crack in his voice when he said, "I had my school ID hanging around my neck." He just didn't care, struck everyone in the room. Then came a former deputy. His name was Harlan Mayfield. He walked slowly, stiff with age, but tall and purposeful. A 35-year veteran of the department, Mayfield had once been Raleigh's right-hand man. Now, under oath, he was the crack in the dam that let the truth flood through. "I served with Sheriff Raleigh for over 2 decades, Mayfield said, gripping the edges of the witness stand like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "And I saw things I should have reported. I heard language I should have challenged. I watched as people were stopped without cause, spoken to like animals, sometimes roughed up, and I stayed quiet." His voice faltered. "I thought it was just the way things were. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it wasn't that serious. But then I saw that dash cam footage of Dr. Morgan, and I saw myself, standing there, watching, and I couldn't do that anymore." Gasps moved through the courtroom. Celeste kept her expression still, but her heart beat hard in her chest. This was more than a confession, it was an awakening. When the defense tried to cross-examine Mayfield, he didn't flinch. "You claim you were complicit," the defense attorney said, raising his voice. "Yet, now you speak out when it's convenient?" Mayfield shook his head. "It's not convenient. It's late. Too late for some, but not for all." More witnesses followed. A single mother, a veteran, a small business owner. All shared variations of the same story, targeted, dismissed, degraded, and ultimately abandoned by a system that was supposed to protect them. The prosecution then played the tapes, the ones that had sealed Raleigh's fate. His voice on the recordings, mocking a preacher, threatening a teenage boy, bragging about keeping certain folks in their place, filled the room like poison. Raleigh didn't look at the screen. He stared down at the table, unmoving. When the final witness stepped down, the judge called for a recess. Celeste walked into the hallway, where clusters of people were whispering, hugging, reflecting. She found a bench near the window and sat, sipping lukewarm water from a paper cup. "He's going down," a familiar voice said beside her. She turned to see Captain Delgado, her expression equal parts somber and satisfied. Celeste nodded. "Maybe not for everything, but for enough." "Mayfield surprised me," Delgado admitted. "Didn't think he had it in him." "He did," Celeste said softly. He just needed someone else to go first. Delgado gave a quiet, thoughtful nod, then added, "You lit a fire under this town, Celeste." Not many people could have done that. Celeste gave a small smile. The fire was already there. I just pulled back the curtain. They sat in silence for a moment before Delgado asked, "You ready for the closing statements?" "I wouldn't miss it." Back in the courtroom, the judge returned to the bench. The attorneys prepared for their final arguments. The room was packed, now standing room only. The prosecutor, a composed woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, stepped forward. "What we've seen here isn't just about one traffic stop," she began. "It's about a system of power that was abused, protected, and hidden. Sheriff Raleigh didn't just bend the rules, he broke them, repeatedly. And he did it while wearing a badge that is supposed to represent trust." She paused, letting that word hang in the air. Trust is the cornerstone of justice. And today, we are here because that trust was betrayed. Then came the defense's turn. Their strategy had shifted. No longer defiant, now they leaned into apology. Raleigh's attorney spoke of a man from another time, someone with flawed judgment and outdated methods. He pointed to Raleigh's years of service, the low crime rate in Red Bluff, the community projects he had once sponsored. "He may have made mistakes," the attorney said, "but he is not a monster. He is a man who served this town in his own way." Raleigh never spoke. He kept his eyes down the entire time. When the judge gave instructions to the jury and sent them to deliberate, the room slowly emptied. Outside the courthouse, it had begun to drizzle. A soft, steady rain, the kind that turns dust into mud and soaks into the cracks of old roads. Celeste sat in her car, watching drops trace lines down the windshield. She didn't know how long deliberation would take, an hour, a day, but she felt, deep in her bones, that something irreversible had already happened. The silence had been broken, the lies exposed. And no matter what verdict came down, Red Bluff would never be the same. 3 hours later, the jury returned. 12 men and women filed back into the box, eyes solemn. The foreman stood. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, guilty. The courtroom buzzed. A few people cried. Others clapped. The judge silenced the room with a single rap of her gavel, then turned to Raleigh. "Sentencing will be scheduled in 2 weeks. Until then, the defendant is remanded into custody." As the bailiff stepped forward to handcuff Raleigh, Celeste watched him rise slowly, still refusing to make eye contact with anyone. He was no longer the sheriff, no longer feared, just a man facing the weight of his own actions. As he passed by her, escorted out of the courtroom, Celeste caught the briefest flicker of recognition in his eyes. Not hate, not even anger, just emptiness. Outside, the rain had stopped. Celeste walked down the courthouse steps, the clouds parting overhead. Delgado stood by the SUV, holding a folder of paperwork in one hand and offering a smile. "You did it," she said. Celeste shook her head gently. "No, we did it." And so did every voice that spoke up. Delgado nodded. "What now?" Celeste looked out over the town of Red Bluff, its streets wet with rain, its future uncertain. "Now," she said, "we begin again." 6 months later, the morning sun spilled across the streets of Red Bluff like a quiet blessing. It was spring now, warm, gentle, and full of possibility. The courthouse lawn was newly trimmed, the flags clean and raised, and the town square buzzed with anticipation. Folding chairs had been arranged in rows under a white tent near the community center, where a modest wooden podium stood waiting. Celeste Morgan stepped out of her car, greeted by a breeze that rustled the leaves and the sound of voices gathering. She wore a soft navy blazer and comfortable flats, a practical choice for the day's ceremony. A welcome back banner fluttered across the entrance, and in its center were bold words that made her pause. "Accountability begins with courage." This time, she hadn't come alone. Representatives from the State Attorney General's office, local pastors, youth leaders, and town residents stood alongside her. The people of Red Bluff had changed not all, not completely, but enough. Enough to care. Enough to build something better. After the trial, Sheriff Buck Raleigh had been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The courtroom had been packed again on the day of sentencing. Though Raleigh had nothing to say, no apology to offer, the town had watched in silence as he was led away. Dale Finnerty, the disgraced commissioner, resigned under pressure shortly after. He avoided jail time through a plea deal, but lost all political influence and became a pariah in his own hometown. In the wake of their departure, something remarkable had taken root. The people had started speaking up not just about injustice, but about what they wanted. They had voted in a new sheriff, an Afro-Latino veteran named Elias Torres, known for fairness, calm leadership, and an unshakable moral compass. A community oversight board was formed, made up of diverse members from every corner of Red Bluff: farmers, retirees, teachers, young people. Training programs were launched for local officers, and Celeste herself had helped draft the new policies. Today marked the official opening of that civilian board's headquarters, a small, refurbished red brick building near the library, with clear windows and an open-door policy symbolic, but also real. Captain Delgado approached from the side. Her usual stern expression softened into something warmer. "You made quite the dent," she said. Celeste smiled. "Not me. Them. They just needed someone to help pull back the curtain." Delgado nodded. "You going to speak?" Just a few words. The chairs filled quickly. Among those seated near the front was Darius, now a high school senior, and his little sister, who waved shyly when she saw Celeste. Next to them sat Levi, the farmer who had lost 5 acres, and Charles Greywolf, the veteran who had once been told to remove his regalia. And near the edge of the crowd, a woman with tight silver curls, Miss S. Ramsey, the grandmother who once handed Celeste a folded note and whispered, "Please read it." It was all there now, past and present, pain and healing, sitting shoulder to shoulder under the spring sun. When Celeste stepped up to the microphone, she took a deep breath and looked out at the town that had once tried to push her away. Now it waited to hear what she had to say. "I've stood in courtrooms," she began, "in training halls, in meetings with governors and chiefs and senators. But today, this is the most meaningful gathering I've ever attended." A quiet murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. "Because this isn't about me. It never was. It's about what happens when people stop waiting for someone else to fix it. When neighbors speak up. When silence breaks. When justice becomes more than a courtroom verdict, it becomes a community promise." She paused, scanning the crowd. "There was a time when this town was defined by fear, by who had power and who didn't. But not anymore. You stood up. You told your stories. And today you get to write new ones." Applause rose around her, soft at first, then full and strong. When she stepped down, several people stood to shake her hand, others to simply say, "Thank you." But the moment that stayed with her came from a tiny figure in a pink dress, holding something in her hands. Darius's little sister approached her shyly, holding up a cardboard sign she'd colored herself. It read, "Thank you for helping us be brave." Celeste knelt down, tears rising in her eyes. "You already were," she said gently. "You just didn't know it yet." Later that afternoon, as the crowd began to disperse and the chairs were folded away, Celeste stood quietly at the steps of the new oversight building. Behind her, workers were still arranging the furniture. Inside, on the main wall, hung a framed quote she had chosen weeks earlier: "Justice begins when one person refuses to look away." She smiled, not because the work was done, it never was, but because it had truly begun. She had come to Red Bluff as a stranger, underestimated, dismissed, humiliated, but she was leaving as something more: proof that truth could prevail, that courage could catch fire, and that even in the smallest corners of the country, change was possible. And as she got into her car, glancing once more at the town in her rear-view mirror, Celeste Morgan knew one thing for sure: The badge she carried wasn't just metal. It was responsibility. And because of Red Bluff, its weight had never felt more worth it. The story of Celeste Morgan isn't just about exposing a corrupt sheriff. It's a powerful reminder that silence is never neutral. In any community, when injustice is tolerated out of fear or habit, it becomes fertile ground for abuse. But all it takes is one person with the courage to speak up for the truth to be heard and for change to begin. This story shows that transformation can start anywhere, even in a quiet town where people once believed their voices didn't matter. For those who've lived through decades of struggle and change, this message is especially meaningful. It's never too late to speak out. It's never too late to do what's right. Courage doesn't always roar sometimes. It's simply telling your story so the next generation can live in a fairer world. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share to help spread this message. Your support means the world, and together, we can keep these important conversations alive.